It's a crazy day, you know. We talked about it last night, and she had told me that she was in fear for her life last night. And I actually helped her lock up the house and get everything together, and then this happened.
Policeman, before I knew it, in an instant, jumped out the car, and I heard him holler like 3 or 4 times, put it away, put it away, put it down, and boom, boom, boom. It's
a big surprise for me. Nah, he wouldn't do that with, put all his career on jeopardy and stuff like that. That don't make no sense.
When 34-year-old Takara Glenn first contacted NCIS to report that her husband, Greg Hightower, who worked for the NCIS as a recruiter, was hitting her, she wasn't taken very seriously. But then it happened again and again, and finally on September 21st, 2022, it happened again. And just like the previous times, she called NCIS to file a report. This time around, they took her seriously and followed up on the report. They wanted to find out why this kept happening all of a sudden, but the moment they opened an official investigation into Takara's accusations, they somehow signed her death warrant. Little did they know that a straightforward investigation into DV would take such a chilling turn. Takara was a lot of things, but what people said about her the most was how loving she was as a mom. She loved her kids and would have easily laid her life for theirs any time. She fought to make sure they had everything they ever wanted and protected them with all she had, even if it meant protecting them with her dying breath.
The female inside the house, when our units arrived, found her deceased, still grabbing or holding on to her infant child.
34-year-old Takara Glenn was born and raised in Texas. She was described by everyone who knew her as a beautiful, gorgeous, intelligent woman who was fiercely loyal to those she loved and had a strong will that got her through even the toughest of days. But as great as she was as a daughter, sister, and friend, her qualities as a mom were what stood out to people the most. Many people who knew her gushed about her natural skills as a mom, describing her as a devoted mother who loved and cared for her children so much, she wanted to be able to provide them with anything they could ever ask for. All she ever did was for them, so it was kind of poetic that the last thing she ever did was for one of her babies. She cared so much for her children. But Takara wasn't just an incredible mother. You see, Takara was a dedicated person, and when she dedicated herself to anything, she hardly ever gave up. She applied that same dedication to her marriage, becoming the most supportive and loving wife she could ever be to her husband, Greg, and one would say she succeeded. Her and Greg's marriage seemed to be long-lasting, withstanding years of knowing each other, ups and downs of a regular relationship, as well as navigating the challenges that come with being a military wife. Greg, originally from Illinois, worked as a senior chief recruiter for the Navy, a position he attained by working hard over the course of 19 years. To the outside world, Takara and Greg were the perfect couple. A power couple, in fact. Their relationship seemed to be the ideal one, where both parties loved and respected one another. But all good things ended, and unfortunately for Takara, her relationship started unraveling as Greg's temper got shorter and shorter until one day, he wasn't just yelling at her or threatening her anymore. He was making good on his threats.
Past family members who were here on the scene told us that couple had been married for about 15 years, had multiple children, but recently struggled with violence.
DV is nothing new in most, if not all, societies. In fact, after the pandemic, there was a record high number of DV cases all over the world, with millions of families affected. In many cases, it doesn't begin at the start of the relationship, and it didn't for Takara. When Takara and Greg first got together, he never laid any hands on her. Heck, he worshipped the ground she walked on. But as the years passed, the love and affection they shared for each turned sour when Greg hit Takara in August 2019. Now, we don't know if August 2019 was the first time he ever laid hands on her, but we do know it was the first time she reported it. Chances are, they'd been happening for years prior, and she finally got the courage to get help. Now, cases of DV in the military are actually high, so they're always looking for new ways to curb DV, which means they take those kinds of reports seriously, and they did the same for Takara's report, at least at first. When Takara initially reported it, they opened an investigation and started looking more closely into Greg's affairs. They started speaking to neighbors, family, friends, and colleagues to determine if he had a history of violence. Although in a lot of DV cases, a lack of a violent history did not prevent them from hitting their partners. Once they started looking more closely at him, Greg got spooked and in retaliation filed a counter-report, claiming that he didn't hit Takara as she claimed. Instead, she was the one who attacked him. Things got pretty confusing for the NCIS agents in charge of the investigation once they started accusing each other. Without any hard evidence, hands, they couldn't know for sure who was telling the truth, so they backed off Greg a bit. In their eyes, this was just a small domestic dispute that the couple was trying to escalate to spite each other. Backing off Greg a bit meant they weren't paying him any further attention. Unfortunately for Tamara, that meant her pain and suffering at Greg's hands had just begun. What the agents didn't know at the time was that they were playing right into Greg's hands. Once he succeeded in getting them to back off, he went right back to attacking Tamara. As time went on, tensions between them escalated. There were more arguments and fights between them, each one even more explosive than the last. But despite all that was going on, Tamara didn't go back to NCIS to file more reports. In fact, it wasn't until September 2022 that Tamara reached out to NCIS again, this time desperate for help. The agents took her complaint very seriously, since this was now the second time she would file such complaints. They knew something was going on that Greg was trying to hide. At that point, Greg was no longer living in the house with Tamara and their 3 kids. He had been forced to move out because Tamara didn't feel safe. In fact, she felt so unsafe that she told a few neighbors what was going on so they could watch out for Greg, just in case he tried to come back.
A neighbor we spoke with says the wife told him multiple times in the past she was scared for her safety.
Try as she might, Tamara couldn't shake the feeling that Greg was out there planning something very dangerous. She had no idea how right she was. On September 21st, 2022, Tamara again spoke to one of her neighbors about Greg. The threats Greg was making were escalating, and until she was able to get the NCIS to arrest him and take him off the streets, she wouldn't feel safe. So on September 21st, she asked her neighbor to help her change the locks to the house. They changed the locks together, and the neighbor stayed to make sure she locked up properly before going to his own home.
It's a crazy day, you know. We talked about it last night, and she told me that she was in fear for her life last night, and I actually helped her lock up the house and get everything together, and then this happened.
While Tamara was working hard to keep her and her children safe inside their home, the NCIS agents were trying to get her statement. She didn't feel comfortable coming into their offices since Greg still worked there, so they offered to meet her at home where she felt safe. On September 22nd, 2022, 2 NCIS showed up to Tamara and Greg's home. On that day, 3 of their children were home, so Tamara wasn't alone. She invited them in, offered them refreshments, and sat down to talk to them as she cradled her baby in her arms. It was difficult for Tamara to even talk to them about Greg. He was her husband that she had been with for almost 2 decades. Reporting him like that felt almost like betraying him, but she knew if she didn't get help, she might be making things worse for her kids. Tamara knew that if she wanted to make sure her children were safe and didn't see or experience any hurt or violence, then she was doing the right thing by getting help. So she sat down, her baby in her arms as she told the agents everything. She also handed them the evidence she had gathered over the years, as well as any other proof she had that Greg was hurting her. The agents were beginning to get a picture of who Greg Hightower really was, and it was not a pretty picture. It was hard for them to believe at first because of the kind of man he made himself out to be in public. But behind closed doors, it seemed he was a monster. Greg and Tamara's neighbors also found it hard to believe. By that day, gossip of what was happening had spread around the neighborhood, and people were talking, mostly expressing disbelief as the image they had of Greg began to change before their very eyes.
Just a relaxed person, just chill and relax. You know, never, like, this incident does not seem like him at all. Nah, they threw me for a loop when they said what he done and stuff.
But when Greg found out his perfectly curated image was beginning to come apart, he lost it. He snapped and barged into their home right in the middle of Tamara's meeting with those agents. What followed would be some of the most horrific couple of minutes those agents had ever witnessed.
In this case, you never know what was going on behind closed doors. NCIS investigators were at the house you see behind me looking into domestic violence issues between a Navy recruiter and his wife. That's when things went terribly wrong yesterday.
As soon as Greg barged in and locked eyes with Tamara, he immediately opened fire on her, firing several times until she hit the ground before turning his weapon on the NCIS agents who had been in the living room with her.
Sheriff Ed Gonzalez says the suspect, a military recruiter, ran into the Humble home and shot and killed his wife, then turned the gun towards agents there doing a domestic violence investigation.
Thankfully, both of them were able to escape outside, but Greg chased them, opening fire on them right in the middle of the street. He successfully hit one of them, but missed the other one as he got into his car and drove off. Once he was gone, the agents walked from household to household, looking for help for the one agent who had been hit. They managed to find a good Samaritan who let them in and offered them first aid treatment to stabilize the agent.
This neighbor, who didn't want to be identified, heard the shots, then saw an injured NCIS agent in her driveway, where crews returned today to clean up blood.
The agents ran house to house trying to find some assistance, and a good Samaritan thankfully opened the door, let the agents in, stabilized the situation briefly until an ambulance could get here and transport.
The sounds of cop car after cop car arriving drew the neighbors who had been hiding in their homes out. The cops got to work clearing the street, making sure Greg wasn't hiding in any of the homes.
But it was pretty loud. So, and then I came outside, I see helicopters flying out in the sky. Then I see a sheriff. He didn't have his lights on, but driving around. A couple of them, I was like, okay, this is something serious.
When they were done with that, they then made their way into the Takara's home, where they saw Takara on the ground. She wasn't breathing, but in her arm, very tightly to her, was her baby. Even though she was in pain and dying, she fell on her back to protect him and didn't let go. They literally had to pry the baby from her cold hands.
The female inside the house, when our units arrived, found her deceased, still grabbing or holding on to her infant child. They were able to rescue the child and get him out to safety.
Miraculously, Takara seemed to have shielded him with her body. None of the bullets hit him, and other than being freaked out by the noise and attention he was getting, he was otherwise fine. He was handed off to family members that had gathered at the house, while the agent who had been hit was rushed to a nearby hospital for treatment. Once they were done on the scene, they put a bolo out on Greg's car and started looking out for information of any sightings of a car like his. But they didn't have to bother. Within minutes of Greg driving off, they got a call from his mother who needed help. According to her, Greg was in his car, refusing to get out, and had been hit by a bullet, probably in the shootout he had with the agents before driving off.
The suspect died on Miss Lane in northwest Harris County after his mother called authorities and said he was hurt in his car.
But when cops got to his mother's house, he still refused to get out of the car. They did everything they could to manage the situation, but eventually things escalated, and he opened fire on them.
The husband later shot and killed by deputies after allegedly opening fire on them at a different scene.
Policeman, before I knew it, in an instant, jumped out the car and I heard him holler like 3 or 4 times, put it away, put it away, put it down, and boom, boom, boom. It was.
So an incident that started on one side of the county ended up at a different part of the county before Greg was taken down.
So here's a map showing you where all this happened. The first shooting on Tulloch Run in the Balmary community in Humboldt. The suspect was killed on the northwest side. A shocking story.
A woman is dead after investigators say her husband shot her and an NCIS agent.
The NCIS agents were here conducting an internal investigation into the now deceased NCIS recruiter. He was apparently the target of domestic abuse allegations.
A few agents stayed back at Takara and Greg's neighborhood to talk to the neighbors about the relationship between Greg and Takara. Even though they were both dead, the case was still active until they're able to establish a timeline of events and determine the motive. For motive, it wasn't so hard to figure it out. Greg saw his well-built reputation falling apart and he couldn't bear it, so he snapped. That answered why he did it, but there were still more questions that needed to be answered. For example, did Greg have any history of violence? When investigators spoke to the neighbors, most of them expressed shock. They could not believe the Greg they knew was capable of doing something that evil.
Some neighbors heard the gunshots. Neighbor Andrew Ologban says he was friends with the suspect.
It's a big surprise for me. Nah, he wouldn't do that with put all his career on jeopardy and stuff like that. That don't make no sense.
And their neighbors were beginning to realize they didn't know Greg at all. Once they had all the facts of the case, the Humboldt County Sheriff's Office then held a conference, updating residents on what went down on that tragic day. The sheriff addressed members of the community, telling them the facts as he knew it.
Sheriff's investigators say an NCIS team was here looking into domestic violence issues between an active duty recruiter and his wife when the recruiter showed up, first shooting and killing her as she held their youngest child, who amazingly was uninjured. The husband then gets into a black car and leaves the scene. He was later shot and killed by a Precinct 4 deputy constable who caught up with him in the Willowbrook area.
But that wasn't all. The sheriff also addressed the number of people present in the house at the time of the incident.
2 children, actually, Eric and Erica, and we can tell you one of those children, according to the sheriff, was actually being held by his mother when her husband shot and killed her.
This child's an orphan now that's going to be without mom and dad, and so it's just tragic all the way around.
The sheriff explained the children were now safe and with family. As he addressed members of the community, one question came up a lot. How did Greg's behavior escalate to this point without them knowing? Did Tamara not report previous attacks?
A domestic violence investigation turned deadly. Any idea how long she had been reporting the domestic situations to law enforcement before this point?
The sheriff explained that Takara had indeed reported previous attacks before the one on that tragic day, but he clarified he wasn't sure how many times she reported him as they were still putting the pieces of the case together.
I don't know in terms of a time period. I was told that there were several incidents that had already been occurring, and so that's the information that we have, and they were following up just to learn more about the allegations that were occurring.
As the pieces came together and the investigation officially closed, Takara's family and friends were left to mourn, and they were shattered. Many of them took to social media to express their feelings on losing her. Her sister took to Facebook to write a beautiful but heartbreaking message to her sister. It read, "My heart is torn into pieces about my baby's sister, my best friend, my first baby before I ever even thought of having a baby, is gone. I'm not okay at all, but the worst thing about all of this is trying to explain to her children that the beautiful, loving, and caring woman that's always been there for them, for every school event, knows all their favorite foods and things, sit all of their drop-offs and pickups from school, knew all their clothes sizes, shoe sizes, helped them with their homework, did their laundry, ran their baths on a daily basis, with hardly any complaints, is no longer here and never coming back. This is the worst nightmare that I can't wake up from." Her best friend also expressed the hurt she carried after losing Takara. She created a GoFundMe account to manage the funeral expenses, and whatever's left would go towards taking care of the 6 children she left behind. In the description part of the GoFundMe, Takara's best friend had this to say, "On September 22, 2022, my best friend's family had a tragic loss. Takara Glenn Hightower was the victim of a senseless and tragic act of domestic violence. The children are being left in the full care of KI's mother, Chinetha. They need all the help and support possible from you. Your donations and prayers for the family will make a difference. No donation is too small. Donations will go towards the funeral and burial expenses for Kai Hightower and the expenses needed for the care of her children. I am hosting this on behalf of the family to allow them the time to mourn their loss. Thanks in advance for your support and prayers." Hey, thank you for watching. Our deepest sympathies go to the family and friends of Takara Glenn. What are your thoughts on this case? Do you know of other similar cases? Let me know in the comments section. And before you go, make sure you like, subscribe, and hit that bell button. See you next time, and stay safe.